The inheritance that shattered our family, secrets, lies, and betrayal. It was one of those quiet Sundays when everything felt right, the kind of afternoon where time seems to slow down and all you can hear is the soft hum of the house. The sun was low in the sky, casting a warm golden light through the kitchen window as we gathered around the table. It was the usual crew, my parents, Ethan, my older brother, and me, along with a couple of cousins who were in town for the weekend. There's something about family dinners like these, the comfort of familiar faces, the clinking of silverware, and the buzz of chatter that makes everything feel normal. I had just returned from a weekend getaway, and as usual, the conversation shifted toward me asking how the trip was, what I'd been up to. Nothing out of the ordinary. My parents always liked to hear about my life as they did with everyone else. But today there was an oddness in the air, something subtle that I couldn't quite place. We were talking about all sorts of things, my job, Ethan's latest project, the weather, when my name came up in relation to something new that had recently landed in my life. I casually mentioned the inheritance. The money from my grandparents had finally come through. I didn't really need it. I'd always been careful with my finances, good at saving and making smart decisions. But still, it was a nice little bonus, a bit of extra security. Nothing extravagant, just a way to tie up some loose ends. The moment I said it, the room went quiet for a beat longer than usual. My dad gave me a strange tight-lipped smile, like he was trying to hide something or maybe unsure of how to react. Mom, she just stared out the window, fiddling with her coffee cup like she was deep in thought. And Ethan, well, Ethan was just Ethan, smiling his usual goofy grin, but mostly keeping quiet, like he always did when things got a little too close to home. It was a little off. A strange vibe settled in. I tried to shake it off, but as the conversation continued, I couldn't ignore the feeling that something was shifting beneath the surface. Something I didn't fully understand yet, but could sense was coming. As the conversation carried on, I could feel the unease creeping up again. My parents were still talking about the usual stuff, but there was a noticeable shift. My mom, who had been quiet for a while, set her coffee cup down with a soft clink. She glanced at my dad, then back at me, her eyes filled with something I couldn't quite read. Then, almost too casually, she said, "You know, Ethan could really use the inheritance more than you right now." The words hung in the air like a thick fog, and for a split second, I thought I had misheard her. My brain struggled to process what she had just said. I looked around the table. Ethan, who had been zoning out, suddenly snapped to attention, his gaze flicking between us. My dad's face went a shade paler, and he quickly avoided my eyes. "What?" I said, my voice sounding louder than I intended. "What do you mean, Mom?" She didn't falter. "Ethan's been struggling financially for a while now. This money, it could really help him get back on his feet." I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. My head spun with confusion. "But he's getting by, right? I mean, he's fine. Aren't you, Ethan?" I looked across the table at him, searching for an explanation. Ethan, of course, just nodded, offering a tight smile. But the tension in his eyes was impossible to ignore. "Yeah," Ethan mumbled, shifting in his chair. "I mean, I'm getting by. It's just, things are a bit complicated." There was a hesitation in his voice, a discomfort that didn't match the calmness of his words. I stared at him, my confusion growing into something sharper. "Complicated? Ethan, you've had more than a few business ideas over the years, but none of them ever really seemed to go anywhere. What's so complicated now?" My mom's face flushed a little. "Ryan, it's not like that. We just thought this could give Ethan a little push in the right direction." I swallowed hard, the weight of her words sinking in. "So, you just decided without asking me? Without even talking to me about it?" The air felt heavy with unspoken truths. It wasn't about the money anymore. It was about something deeper, something I hadn't even known was there. There was a sense of unfairness, a feeling that I had been overlooked, dismissed without a second thought. The way they were talking as if my stability, my hard work, my success somehow meant less than Ethan's endless stream of failed ventures. Ethan looked up at me, his eyes avoiding mine, and for a brief moment there was an almost apologetic expression on his face. But it didn't last. He quickly turned his attention back to his plate, like the conversation was happening in a distant world he didn't want to engage with. The silence between us was deafening. It was clear now. My parents, my own parents, had chosen to believe Ethan's version of things, the story of a man perpetually struggling, rather than seeing me, the one who had worked tirelessly for everything I had. "So, you're saying you gave Ethan my inheritance?" The question slipped out before I could stop it, my voice rising despite myself. Mom's eyes widened and she looked at my dad, who cleared his throat awkwardly. "It's not like that, Ryan. We thought he needed it more." I felt a cold rush of frustration flood over me and the room seemed to shrink. How could they say that? How could they just hand it over without even consulting me? I had worked so hard for what I had. I didn't need the inheritance, sure, but I deserved the same respect. Everything I had done, all the choices I had made to stay responsible, to stay on track, none of it seemed to matter. Ethan's reckless behavior, his endless attempts to make it big, and his constant cycle of failure, somehow that was what they were choosing to support. The shock of betrayal hit me like a wave, slowly, until it drowned out everything else. I didn't know what to say anymore. The words seemed pointless. They had made up their minds. And what really stung was that they hadn't even bothered to ask me how I felt. I sat there in silence, the weight of everything settling on my chest. The days following that dinner felt like they were dragging on forever, each hour stretching into the next with a suffocating weight. I couldn't stop replaying what had happened, the words my mom had said echoing in my mind. Ethan could really use the inheritance more than you right now. It didn't make sense. It didn't add up. Me work hard for everything I had, would just hand over something that was rightfully mine. There had to be more to it. There had to be something I was missing. Ethan's struggles never seemed to add up. He'd been talking about his latest business ventures, each one sounding more promising than the last, but nothing ever seemed to come of it. My frustration twisted into suspicion. Could it be that Ethan was still playing the same old story? That he had convinced our parents once again to buy into his endless narrative of failure? I needed answers. A few days passed, but nothing changed. My parents acted like nothing was wrong, and Ethan kept to himself, still smiling that damn smile, like everything in his life was going exactly as planned. But then, one afternoon, I heard something that changed everything. I was walking up the stairs to the second floor when I heard my mom's voice drift up from the kitchen. It was low, just enough to catch my attention, but not so loud that I could ignore it. I leaned against the railing, holding my breath. "I think Ethan's finally got it right this time," my mom was saying. "The new business idea looks promising. He's been talking about it non-stop." The word struck me like a slap in the face. New business idea? Ethan had told me nothing about this. He'd always painted himself as a man struggling to make ends meet. Yet now, my mom was speaking as if everything was on track, as if all of his past failures didn't matter. "Right?" my dad replied, his voice unusually quiet. "And if it works out, he'll finally be able to get ahead. No more scraping by." I felt a chill run down my spine. What was going on? Ethan had been talking about debts, about being on the edge of bankruptcy just days before. Now he was getting ahead? Was my family seriously blind to this? "But we have to make sure he doesn't fall back into his old habits," my mom continued. "We can't let him go back to the cycle of debt. He's got a lot riding on this." I stepped back from the railing, my heart pounding in my chest. This wasn't just about business anymore. This was about a lie. One that Ethan had been telling for years. He wasn't struggling. He wasn't drowning in debt. He was getting financial backing for his ventures, and no one had told me about it. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. Ethan, the brother I had been told needed the inheritance more than I did, was fine. More than fine. He was playing everyone, including me, and my parents, my own parents, had bought into it. They had been deceived by his carefully constructed story. I was angry, more than angry. I was betrayed, not just by Ethan, who I had always tried to help, but by my parents, who had dismissed my own achievements and hard work in favor of a narrative that wasn't even true. For days, I couldn't shake the feeling that everything I had worked for, everything I had built, was being overshadowed by Ethan's endless cycle of excuses. Couldn't let this go. The truth was finally unraveling, slowly but surely, and with it came the overwhelming weight of betrayal. I wasn't sure how it had gotten this far, how my parents could have been so blind to the lies Ethan had spun, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going to sit quietly while they continued to support this charade. I needed to confront them, to make them see what I had uncovered, because I couldn't ignore it any longer. The truth had surfaced, and with it, everything I thought I knew about my family had been shattered. The days leading up to the next family dinner felt like an eternity. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was on the edge of something big, something that would change everything. My mind raced with questions I had to ask, things I couldn't keep bottled up any longer. The truth was out there now, and I was going to get to the bottom of it. There was no way I could let this slide. The more I thought about it, the angrier I became. How could my parents be so easily fooled? And how could Ethan, my own brother, keep playing this game while I stood by, quietly watching? I didn't know what I was expecting to happen that night, but I knew one thing for sure. The dinner was going to be the moment everything came to light. I wasn't going to let anyone walk away from this without facing the truth. I spent the days leading up to it trying to stay calm, keeping my composure. But inside, I was a storm. I rehearsed what I'd say over and over in my head, trying to prepare myself for the inevitable confrontation. What would my parents say when I confronted them? What about Ethan? I wasn't sure how it was going to unfold, but I was ready for whatever came next. The night of the dinner arrived. It started like any other. The familiar smell of my mom's lasagna filled the house. The clinking of silverware echoed through the dining room, and the chatter around the table was just the usual hum of family conversation. My parents were talking about their recent trip. Ethan was casually smiling, and I just sat there, the weight of everything pressing on me. But beneath all the casual talk and laughter, the tension was thick. It hung in the air like a cloud that no one dared acknowledge. It was as if everyone was pretending everything was fine, but we all knew it wasn't. I kept glancing at Ethan, noticing the way he kept looking at his plate, avoiding eye contact. And my parents, well, they acted like nothing had happened, like they didn't even see the rift growing between us. I couldn't take it anymore. The small talk felt suffocating. The polite conversations about the weather and work were meaningless in the face of what had just happened. So I decided to break the silence. "Hey, Ethan," I said, my voice calm but carrying an edge. "How's that new business venture of yours going? The one you've been working on? Mom and Dad mentioned it the other day. Sounds promising." The moment the words left my mouth, I could feel the air in the room shift. My mom froze, her fork halfway to her mouth. My dad looked up from his plate, his expression unreadable. And Ethan's face shifted from its usual relaxed grin to something more guarded. His eyes widened for just a second before he quickly recovered. Yeah," Ethan said, a little too quickly. It's going fine. Nothing too big yet, but we're making progress. A friend of mine had an idea, and we're working on it together." I kept my tone light, almost casual, but the words were coming out with purpose. "Right? A friend? Huh? That's great. Investors too, I hear." I raised an eyebrow, watching his reaction closely. Ethan's fork paused midair, and his eyes flickered to my parents for a split second before he put the utensil down. He shifted in his seat, clearly uncomfortable now. "Yeah, well, it's still early days. We've got a couple of people backing us, but it's nothing to get excited about just yet." I could see my mom's face tighten, and my dad adjusted his glasses, looking down at his plate again. The silence that followed felt like it stretched on forever. I could almost hear their hearts pounding in their chests, their discomfort growing by the second. But I wasn't going to let it go. Not this time. "Funny?" I continued, my voice smooth but sharp. "Because the last I checked, you were drowning in debt, claiming you couldn't make ends meet. But now you're telling me you've got investors backing your latest idea? That's a pretty big jump, don't you think?" Ethan's face flushed, and he stammered, his words coming out in quick bursts. It's not like that, Ryan. I've been working on it for a while, and things are looking up. It's not what you think." I could see the cracks in his story, and it was hard to hide the disgust that was building in me. My parents, who had once prided themselves on being able to see through people, had bought into this. Hook, line, and sinker. And now here I was, confronting them all with the truth they were too afraid to see. The tension at the table was suffocating now. My mom looked between Ethan and me, her face pale. She opened her mouth as if to say something, but the words never came. My dad cleared his throat, but still, neither of them dared to speak. I leaned back in my chair, my heart racing, but my voice steady. "So, I guess all those stories about needing the inheritance to pay off your debts, those were just that. Stories." The moment hung in the air. The silence was deafening. And as I sat there, watching my parents squirm, I knew I had just crossed the point of no return. There was no going back now. The truth was out, and no one could deny it anymore. I waited for one of them to speak, for someone to explain, to justify what had happened. But the words never came. The table was too quiet. Ethan avoided my gaze, his hands shaking slightly as he pushed his food around on his plate. My parents, for the first time, looked like they didn't know what to say. And for the first time, I felt the control slip from their hands. I had finally spoken up. I had finally forced the truth into the open. And as the weight of the moment settled in, I knew this was only the beginning. The real confrontation was just starting. The silence that followed my question seemed to stretch on forever. Ethan's face went pale, his lips parted, but no words came out. His hand trembled slightly as he reached for his drink, but even that seemed forced. My parents were frozen, their eyes flicking between Ethan and me, but none of them dared to speak. I could feel the weight of the truth pressing down on me, the revelation that had been building for days, now bubbling to the surface. I took a deep breath, steadying myself for what I was about to say. "Ethan," I said, my voice steady but sharp, "I know about the investors. You've been lying about your financial situation. You've been getting outside investment for your business ventures while you've been telling Mom and Dad you're drowning in debt. You've been playing them and you've been playing me." The words hit like a bombshell. Ethan flinched as if I'd physically struck him, his eyes widening with panic. The room, which had been filled with the usual hum of family chatter, was now deafeningly silent. Even the usual clink of silverware had stopped, replaced by the heavy sound of my own heart pounding in my ears. My mom looked as though the floor had just dropped out from under her. She blinked rapidly, her face a mixture of shock and confusion. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. My dad, on the other hand, looked like he was trying to shrink into his chair, avoiding eye contact, his hands trembling as he pushed his plate to the side. Ethan was still silent, staring at me, his face reddening as he struggled to form a response. But it was clear he had no excuse. The truth had come out, and there was no way for him to deny it anymore. My parents, the people who had always prided themselves on knowing what was best for their children, had been duped. I felt my chest tighten, the anger and frustration that had been simmering inside me finally spilling over. "How could you, Ethan?" I demanded, my voice shaking with emotion. "How could you do this to me? To Mom and Dad? You've been telling them you needed that inheritance money to get out of debt. But the whole time you were just waiting for the next handout, pretending to be the victim. And I glanced at my parents, my voice rising with hurt. "They just believed you. They didn't even give me a chance to say how I felt. They didn't even ask me what I needed." The weight of it all hit me then. The years of watching Ethan flit from one failed idea to the next, always convincing everyone around him that he was on the verge of something big, only to watch it crumble. My parents had always been so quick to jump to his defense, convinced that he was the one who needed the most help. And I had always been fine. Too fine, maybe. Too capable. Too stable. All these years, I've worked my ass off, done everything I was supposed to. I continued, my voice trembling with raw emotion. And yet, here I am, watching you get everything without ever having to face the consequences of your actions. You lied to everyone, Ethan. You lied to me, and now look at what it's done to this family. Ethan opened his mouth, but no words came out. He looked between me and my parents, his eyes flickering with guilt, but he didn't speak. What was there to say? The truth was out now. The facade was gone. My mom finally found her voice, but it wasn't the comforting, maternal tone I was used to. It was shaky, unsure. "Ryan," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "We didn't know. We didn't know about the investors. We thought we were helping. We thought this was what he needed." I shook my head, the frustration building to a point where I could barely breathe. "You didn't even ask me, Mom. You just gave it to him. You didn't ask how I felt. You didn't ask if I needed help, if I wanted that inheritance money. You just assumed I was fine." The silence that followed was crushing. My parents were quiet, their eyes lowered, guilt written across their faces. Ethan was still silent, His shoulders slumped as if the weight of everything had suddenly become too much for him to carry. I stood up from the table, my chair scraping loudly against the floor. "I can't keep doing this," I said, my voice sharp. "I've been trying to be the good son, the one who doesn't cause trouble, the one who just goes along with everything. But I can't anymore. I won't be your pawn in this game. I'm done." The room was still, no one daring to speak. My words hung in the air, a bitter truth that no one could escape. I looked at my parents, my brother, and I realized things would never be the same. I had exposed the lie. And no matter what happened next, there was no going back. The emotional climax had been reached. The silence that filled the room was deafening, and in that silence, everything Ryan had been feeling, the hurt, the frustration, the betrayal, came to the surface. The room was still, the air heavy with unsaid words as I stood there, feeling the weight of everything that had just unfolded. My parents were staring at me, their faces a mixture of confusion, disbelief, and guilt. Ethan, on the other hand, hadn't said a word since my confrontation. He didn't even look at me. His eyes were fixed on the table, his hands gripping his glass so tightly that his knuckles had turned white. I felt a surge of anger and hurt, but more than that, I felt a growing sense of clarity. I had spent so long trying to be the person they wanted me to be, the son who always followed the rules, who never rocked the boat. But today everything had changed. I wasn't going to be the person anymore. I wasn't going to let them decide my life for me. I took a deep breath, my heart pounding in my chest, and I made my decision. "I've sold my portion of the inheritance," I said, my voice cold but steady. "I don't want it. I gave it all away, donated it to charity." The words hung in the air, heavy and final. "I'm done with this. I'm done with you all." The shock was immediate. My mom's hand trembled as she reached for her glass, her eyes wide with disbelief. My dad's face drained of color, and he opened his mouth as if to say something, but no words came out. Ethan, still silent, looked up briefly, his eyes full of guilt, but not a single word of apology passed his lips. The tension in the room was suffocating. The family dinner that had once been filled with warmth and comfort now felt like a distant memory. My parents couldn't understand. How could they? They had lived in their bubble for so long, always protecting Ethan, always believing his lies, that they didn't know how to process the truth when it was finally laid bare before them. I glanced at my parents one last time. I didn't wait for them to speak. There was nothing left to say. They had made their choice, and now I was making mine. "I've done enough," I said, my voice firmer now, even though the sting of betrayal still cut through me. "I've given everything I had to this family, and this is how I'm treated. I'm not going to let you control me anymore. I'm walking away." And with that, I turned and walked out of the room. As I stepped outside, the cool evening air hit me, and I felt a strange sense of liberation. It was as if I had been carrying a weight for years, and now it was finally gone. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I could breathe again. I had taken control of my own narrative. I had stopped letting my family's toxic dynamics dictate who I was and what I did. The road ahead was uncertain. I didn't know what the future held or how my relationship with my family would look moving forward. But in that moment, none of that mattered. What mattered was that I had made a decision for myself. I had chosen to walk away from the lies, the manipulation, and the resentment that had been festering in my heart for so long. I was no longer the person who let the past define me. I wasn't going to let my family's actions control my future. I was going to forge my own path, no matter how hard it might be. As I walked away from the house, the sound of my footsteps seemed to echo in the quiet night. And for the first time, I felt free. Free from the anger, the frustration, and the feeling of never being seen for who I truly was. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't about getting back at anyone. It was about reclaiming my own life. Because sometimes the best way to deal with betrayal isn't to fight back with anger, it's to take back control and walk away. And that's exactly what I did.